significantly complicate our CI pipeline, and we also have to introduce a couple of additional values. First, we have to specify all of the respective secrets. This is the database connection string and the Azure Web App publish profile. So I'll go to the repository secrets and create a new one, and I'm going to add the proper name and the value for the database connection string. Let me click add secret, and then let's add another repository secret. This one is going to be the Azure Web App publish profile. If you're wondering how to get this value, you should navigate to the DevHabit API app service, and there is the download publish profile button. Now for this to work, we have to go into settings and then configuration, and we have to make sure that SCM basic auth publishing credentials is turned on. Otherwise you won't be able to download the publish profile. Now once you download this, go ahead and copy the contents of the publish profile, and you can add them as the secret value. So I'm going to say add secret, and we've set up all the secrets we need, and we need to make a slight adjustment to our code. To be able to properly generate the migrations inside of our CI pipeline, we have to add some design time factories for our database context. So I'm going to add a new class inside of the database folder, and I will call it the application DB context factory. Here's what the implementation is going to look like. We'll implement the iDesignTime DB context factory interface and specify our database context type. Then we have to implement the create DB context method, and here I just want to initialize the database context options builder, configure it to use MPG-SQL, configure the correct migration history table, and using the snake case naming convention, and then I'm going to return a new instance of my database context. The connection string value doesn't matter, and I'm just going to use this constant value. Now let's do the same for the other database context that we have, the application identity DB context, and I have to make a couple of adjustments. So let me make sure this compiles correctly. I will update the name of this factory, and we also have to use the identity schema. So let me move this into its own file. You should make sure that the project is building and that you can run it locally, and if everything checks out, then go ahead and commit these values, and let's take a look at our updated CI pipeline. If I navigate to the GitHub action that I just triggered, you can see that it's now quite a bit more complex. We have 3 jobs that are going to run one after another. First, there is the build and test job that's going to build our application, run the tests, which is also going to execute our integration tests and our functional tests, and this gives us a lot of confidence that we can proceed with this pipeline. After this completes successfully, we can move into applying database migrations and finally deploying our application to Azure. Now let me step into the build and test job, and you can see that the build step is about to complete and it's going to kick off the testing step. After a bit of time, the testing step is going to complete. Our publish step is going to execute pretty quickly, and uploading the artifacts is also going to complete very fast. Now you can see that having so many integration tests inside of our CI pipeline definitely slows down the entire process. It took more than 2 minutes for the build and test job to complete. Now let's take a look at our next step, which is applying database migrations. I'm already on the step that's creating my migration bundles, and this is going to produce the executable files that we can use to run the migrations. Now remember that this requires us to provide a connection string, which may not always be a great idea from a security perspective. Also, another thing to consider is that you don't really have a way to recover if any of these migrations go wrong, which is why I personally prefer applying my migrations manually by generating these SQL scripts. Now, another thing you can do here that's a bit more advanced is using different environments in your CI pipeline. This will allow you to stop when a particular step completes. For example, we can stop the pipeline after applying database migrations, and our database administrator can review the process and see if there are any issues. It would be ideal if we could also generate these SQL scripts so that they can easily review them. Now you can see my 2 steps for applying the app migrations and the identity migrations, which are both going to complete, and I currently don't have any migrations applied, so there's nothing to be done. Now if I go into my next job, deploying to Azure, you can see it already completed. It took just about 28 seconds. And what happens here is we download the artifact from the build job, which contains the published DevHabit API project, and then we're going to execute the deploy step, which is going to use the Azure Web Apps Deploy version 2 GitHub action. And this GitHub action allows us to easily deploy our API into Azure. We have to provide the application name, the publish profile, which is provided from a secret, the path to the publish directory, and then you can provide any environment variables that that you need. We don't need any here, and essentially you can see our deployment is going to complete, and we can navigate to the application URL. Let me copy this value, and if I navigate to the Scalar UI, I should be able to see my API documentation. So our backend application seems to be deployed correctly. Now let's jump into the client application, and I will try signing in again. I'm navigated to the dashboard, where I'll probably have to wait a few moments for my data to load, but it's going to load eventually, and it seems to be working. So this is how we can automate the client and the API deployments using GitHub Actions. Now let's actually confirm that this is working. I'm just going to make a small update to the client application, and the one change I'm going to make is include the current date after the dashboard. So let's go ahead and deploy this change. I can jump into my GitHub action to make sure that this completes. You can see the build process completes in a couple of seconds. Then we have to wait for the static web app CLI to be installed. And after this step completes, we're going to go ahead and deploy our client application to Azure Static Web Apps. And you can see our deployment complete successfully. So now I should be able to click this link here and navigate to the client application, where you can see our new update is properly rendered on the screen. And I think we can wrap up this lesson about automating deployments using GitHub Actions. We've really come a long way from our first chapter in this course, where I introduced you to the concept of REST. Then I showed you how to build a REST API with some of the most important functionality that a REST API should support. We then introduced HateOS to our REST API by returning hypermedia links in our API responses, and we also implemented content negotiation and API versioning. We added authentication and authorization support to our REST API. We introduced the client application that integrates with our REST API and uses the hypermedia links that we are returning to drive the state of our client application. We then tackled some advanced REST API concerns, testing our REST API, where we mainly focused on integration and functional testing because it has the highest ROI. Lastly, I showed you how to add rich documentation to our REST API using Swagger, and how to turn the OpenAPI specification that we generated into beautiful API documentation using Scalar. In the end, this course wouldn't be complete without deploying the application that we've built, and this is what we've done in the current lesson, where we deployed our application to Azure. I honestly hope that you enjoyed this course and learned many new things, and I think you are ready to go out there and build amazing and pragmatic REST APIs. Thanks a lot for being a student and investing your time in this course, and don't forget to stay awesome.